Adam, maybe just give us a sense. Obviously, you're in the opposition caucus. There's been some privacy issues in our society, in our country. What are you looking for in this legislation that will help protect the privacy of individuals?
Well, first, speaking, personally as a member of parliament, not necessarily on behalf of the party, of course, I'm looking for a few things. One, I mentioned earlier, the recognition of a data right for individuals is very important. At the same time, I think this is going to be a balance between the requirements that we place on businesses, in particular small businesses, to conform with legislation. And so we want to be careful about not creating unnecessary burdens with respect to the level of additional red tape, if you will, on small businesses. So there has to be some common sense applied to what we're going to be asking industry to do. In addition, I think there's opportunities perhaps to strengthen legislation. There are carve-outs right now for corporations, in particular financial institutions, to share information with each other in cases of suspected fraud. One of the things I've been hearing a lot about, especially on the money laundering file, is to allow financial institutions to share information with each other in cases of suspected money laundering. That is not dealt in the legislation, but is one of these issues that is, fraud and money laundering is a huge issue right across this country, upwards of $100 billion a year. So I'd say that there's some common sense tweaks and suggestions of potential amendments that you could see come to this legislation. And of course, on the AI front, Canada has a little bit of an edge when it comes to AI. We want to make sure that any regulations recognize that we want a strong artificial intelligence industry in Canada, and not make it so that companies don't want to invest in Canada because it's too overbearing. So it's all about finding that balance between respecting people's privacy and data rights, but also recognizing we want to create an environment where businesses and private sector can thrive.
Stephen Taylor, does this bill then strike the right balance, as Adam is talking about? Or are you confident that privacy rights can be maintained, but also some of these legitimate public policy goals, preventing fraud, as Adam mentioned, can be achieved as well?
Well, we'll see. A lot of members of the legal community in Canada, when asked about Bill C-27 and the future of the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, are waiting to see what Parliament does with this legislation when it will pass. There have been some comments around the length it's taking for the legislation to be debated, developed. I think there probably needs to be more stakeholder conversations with parliamentarians, both from a consumer and a business side, to iron out the details and go through what some of these challenges for businesses can be. But one point I will say that is in the draft legislation, certainly for consumer protection, the legislation proposes fines of up to $25 million or 5% of global turnover.
Right.
This is very similar to what we see under GDPR in Europe. So for companies, particularly big companies who blatantly violate privacy laws, Canada now has the ability, with this legislation when it comes into force, to really give out some pretty strong fines. So we'll see how that gets developed, and how the enforcement agencies actually implement their ability to fine companies. Will they issue really large fines, or will they hold back a bit? That's to be determined.
Yeah, so I guess that's one of the big issues, is what are the impacts of noncompliance, right? Like, is this legislation going to have teeth? And you make the point that you can have the teeth in legislation, but if it's not actually applied, it really is a paper tiger. Is that what you're concerned about, Stephen?
I think that's right. I think we need to know more. What will the mandate be for the enforcement agency? This legislation, in addition to creating an AI data commissioner, it will also create an enlarged privacy commissioner with additional powers. And it would be interesting to scrutinize a little bit what the mandate of that agency is, and how they're going to enforce this legislation, because this agency will have a very large amount of power: who to prosecute, how much to charge, fines. There's also quasi-criminal prosecution being mentioned in Bill C-27 for violation of the legislation. So I think more discussion needs to happen. And frankly, I'm surprised this legislation isn't getting more coverage in the press, because
Right.
this is really a fundamental overhaul of
Indeed.
PIPEDA, and will impact all businesses in Canada that process personal information.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. We're going to take a brief break with our guests. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.